Morning. Welcome to Tuesdays with a Pilgrim as we continue reading In His Steps, Chapter 4, Part A. During the week, Edward Norman received numerous letters commenting on the absence from the news of the account of the prize fight. 2 or 3 of these letters may be of interest. To the editor of the News. Dear Sir, I have been thinking for some time to change my paper. I want a journal that is up to the times, progressive and enterprising, supplying the public demand at all points. The recent freak of your paper in refusing to print the account of the famous contest at the resort has decided me to finally change my paper. Please discontinue it. Yours very truly. Here followed the name of a businessman who had been a subscriber for many years. To the editor of the Times. Dear Ed, what is this sensation you have given the people of your burg? What new policy have you taken up? Hope you don't intend to try the, quote, reform business, unquote, through the avenue of the press. It's dangerous to experiment along that line. Take my advice and stick to the enterprising modern methods you have made so successful for the news. The public wants prize fights and such. Give it what it wants and let someone else do the reforming. Yours. Here followed the name of one of Norman's oldest friends, the editor of a daily in an adjoining town. My dear Mr. Norman, I hasten to write you a note of appreciation for the evident carrying out of your promise. It is a splendid beginning, and no one feels the value of it better than I do. I know something of what it will cost you, but not all. Your pastor, Henry Maxwell. One letter that he opened immediately after reading this from Maxwell revealed to him something of the loss to his business that possibly awaited him. Dear Edward Norman, editor of the Daily News. Dear Sir, at the expiration of my advertising limit, you will do me the favor not to continue as you have done heretofore. I enclose a check for payment in full and shall consider my account with you closed after that date. Yours very truly. Here followed the name of one of the largest dealers in tobacco in the city. He had been in the habit of inserting a column of conspicuous advertising and paying a very large price for it. Norman laid this letter down thoughtfully, and then, after a moment, he took up a copy of his paper and looked through the advertising columns. There was no connection implied in the tobacco merchant's letter between the omission of the prize fight and the withdrawal of the advertisement, but he could not avoid putting the two together. In point of fact, he afterward learned that the tobacco dealer withdrew his advertisement because he had heard that the editor of the News was about to enter upon some queer reform policy that would be certain to reduce his subscription list. But the letter directed Norman's attention to the advertising phase of his paper. He had not considered this before. As he glanced over the columns, he could not escape the conviction that his master could not permit some of them in his paper. What would he do with the paper's advertising of choice liquors and cigars? As a member of a church and a respected citizen, he had incurred no special censure because the liquor interest advertised in his columns. No one thought anything about it. It was all legitimate business. Why not? Raymond enjoyed a system of easy licenses, and the saloon and the pool hall and the beer garden were part of the city's daily life. He was simply doing what every other businessman in Raymond did, and it was one of the best paying sources of revenue. What would the paper do if he cut these out? Could it live? That was the question. But was that the question after all? What would Jesus do? That was the question he was answering, or trying to answer this week. Would Jesus advertise whiskey and tobacco in his paper? Edward Norman asked it honestly, and after a prayer for help and wisdom, he called Clark into his office. Clark came in feeling that the paper was in a crisis, and prepared for almost anything after his Monday morning experience. This was Thursday. Clark, said Norman, speaking slowly and carefully. "I have been looking at our advertisements and have decided to dispense with certain ones when the contracts run out. I wish you would notify the advertising agent not to solicit or renew the ads I have marked here." He handed the paper with the marked places over to Clark, who took it and looked over the columns with a serious air. "This will mean a great loss to the News. How long do you think you can keep this sort of thing up?" Clark was astonished at the editor's action and could not understand it. "Clark, do you think if Jesus were the editor and proprietor of a daily paper in Raymond, he would print advertisements of whiskey and tobacco in it?" "Well, no. I suppose he wouldn't. But what has that to do with us? We can't do as he would do. Newspapers can't run on any such basis." "Why not?" asked Norman quietly. "Why not? Because they will lose more money than they make, that's all." Clark spoke with irritation. "We shall certainly bankrupt the paper with this sort of business policy." "Do you think so?" Norman asked the question not as if he expected an answer, but simply as if he were talking with himself. After a pause, he said, "You may direct Marx to do as I said. I believe it is what Jesus would do, and as I have told you, Clark, that is what I have promised to try to do for a year, regardless of what the results may be to me. There are some other advertisements of a doubtful character I shall study too. Meanwhile, I have a conviction in regard to these that cannot be silenced." Clark went back to his desk feeling enraged and alarmed. He was sure the paper would be ruined as soon as it became generally known that the editor was trying to do everything by such an impractical moral standard. What would become of business if this standard were adopted? It would upset every custom and introduce endless confusion. It was simply foolishness. It was downright idiocy, so Clark said to himself. And when Marx was informed of the action, he seconded the managing editor with some very forcible exclamations. What was the matter with the chief? Was he insane? Was he going to bankrupt the whole business? But Edward Norman had not yet faced his most serious problem. When he came down to the office Friday morning, he was confronted with the usual plan for the Sunday morning edition. The News was one of the few evening papers to issue a Sunday edition, and it had always been remarkably successful financially. There was an average of 1 page of literary and religious items to 30 pages of sports, theater, gossip, fashion, society, and political material. This made a very interesting magazine of all sorts of reading material, and it had always been welcomed by all his subscribers as a Sunday morning necessity. Edward Norman now put to himself the question, what would Jesus do? If he were editor of the paper, would he deliberately plan to put into the homes of all the church people of Raymond such a collection of reading matter on the one day of the week that ought to be given up to something better and holier? He was, of course, familiar with the regular argument for the Sunday paper, that the public needed it, especially the working men who would not go to church anyway, and who ought to have something entertaining and instructive on their Sunday, their only day of rest. But suppose the Sunday morning paper did not pay. Suppose there was no money in it. How eager would the editor or proprietor be then to supply this crying need of the working man? Edward Norman communed honestly with himself over the subject, taking everything into account. Would Jesus edit a Sunday morning paper whether it paid or not? That was not the question. As a matter of fact, the Sunday News paid so well that it would be a direct loss of thousands of dollars to discontinue it. Besides, the regular subscribers had paid for a 7-day paper. Had he any right to now give them anything less than what they had paid for? He was honestly perplexed by the question. So much was involved in the discontinuance of the Sunday edition that for the first time he almost declined to be guided by the standard of what Jesus' probable action would be. He was sole proprietor of the paper. It was his to shape as he chose. He had no board of directors to consult as to policy. But as he sat there surrounded by the usual quantity of material for the Sunday edition, he reached some definite conclusions, and among them was the determination to call in the force of the paper and frankly state his motive and purpose. He sent word to Clark for the clerical staff, reporters, plant foremen, and those men already at work in the composing rooms to come to the mailing room. This was a large room, and the curious men came in and perched around on the tables and counters. It was a very unusual proceeding, and they all watched Mr. Norman intently as he spoke. I have called you in here to let you know of my future plans for the news. I propose certain changes that I believe are necessary. I understand that some things I have already done are regarded by you men as very strange. I wish to state my motive in doing what I have done. And then he told the men what he had already told Clark, and they stared as he had done, and looked as painfully upset. Now, in acting on this standard of conduct, I have reached a conclusion that will, no doubt, cause some surprise. I have decided that the Sunday morning edition of the news shall be discontinued after next Sunday's issue. I shall state in that issue my reasons for discontinuing, in order to make up to the subscribers the amount of reading matter they may suppose themselves entitled to. We can issue a double number on Saturday, as is done by many evening papers that make no attempt at a Sunday edition. I am convinced that from a Christian point of view, more harm than good has been done by our Sunday morning paper. I do not believe that Jesus would be responsible for it if he were in my place today. It will occasion some trouble to arrange the details caused by this change with the advertisers and subscribers. That is for me to look after. The change itself is one that will take place. So far as I can see, the loss will fall on myself. Neither the reporters nor the pressmen need make any particular changes in their plans. He looked around the room and no one spoke. He was struck for the first time in his life with the fact that in all the years of his newspaper life, he had never had the workforce of the paper together in this way. Would Jesus do that? He thought to himself. This is, would he run a paper on the same basis where editors, reporters, pressmen, and all could meet to discuss and devise and plan for the making of a paper that should have in view? He caught himself drawing away from the fact of typographical unions and office rules and reporters' enterprise and all the cold business-like methods that made a great daily successful. But still, the vague picture that came up in the mailing room would not fade away when Norman had gone back to his office and the men had returned to their places, with wonder in their looks and questions of all sorts on their tongues. Clark came in and had a long, serious talk with his chief. He was thoroughly roused, and his protest almost reached the point of resigning his position. Norman guarded himself carefully. Every minute of the interview was painful to him, but he felt more than ever the necessity of doing the Christ-like thing. Clark was a valuable man. It would be difficult to fill his place, but he was not able to give any reason for continuing the Sunday paper that answered the question, what would Jesus do? It comes to this then, said Clark finally. You will bankrupt the paper in 30 days. We might as well face that future fact. I don't think we shall. Will you stay by the news until it is bankrupt? Asked Norman with a strange smile. Mr. Norman, I don't understand you. You are not the same man this week that I knew before. I don't know myself either, Clark. Something remarkable has caught me up and borne me on. But I was never more convinced of final success and power for the paper. You have not answered my question. Will you stay with me? Clark hesitated a moment and finally said yes. Norman shook hands with him and turned to his desk. Clark went back to his room, stirred by a number of conflicting emotions. He had never before known such an exciting and mentally disturbing week, but he felt now as if he were connected with an enterprise that might at any moment collapse and ruin him and all connected with it. And we'll end there for this week. Next week we'll pick up with Chapter 4, Part B, which takes place on Sunday morning. Until then, take care, stay safe,